Set your course for the Hoth
Takes podcast.
Welcome back to Hoth Takes. This is episode 4. I'm Eric Geller.
I'm Grace Seegers.
And I'm Haley Birdwilt.
And in this episode, we're talking about what I think is safe to say is the most controversial of the Star Wars sequel films, The Last Jedi, written, directed by Rian Johnson. We're going to obviously have a lot to say about this movie, so I will say up front that we're not going to get to everything in this episode, but that's the great thing about doing a podcast is you can come back to this stuff whenever you want, so I'm sure we'll be talking about The Last Jedi in the future in many different ways. But in this episode, I think we're going to talk about the character development that we see in this film. There's a lot that goes on here with all the main characters, and some of it is good, some of it, not so much, but I'm looking forward to talking about it. Let's start with Rey, since she's obviously the one who is challenged, arguably challenged the most in this movie, and has some of the most interesting growth. Grace, what was your take as you watched this movie about how she confronts her force powers? Because, going into this, that was everybody's big hope, is that they get to see what happens after she reaches out with the lightsaber. Does she become this super, OP, Jedi? Like, what does she do? And, I think the payoff here was quite interesting.
Yeah, so first off, I have to say that I am a bit of a Last Jedi apologist. I like it. I think it is good. I have a lot of problems with it, as we will get into, but ultimately it is probably my favorite of the sequel trilogy, which I know is very controversial. So just putting my cards on the table there, and with those cards on the table, I like Rey's development in this movie. I think it's really interesting to see her kind of come into her own as a Jedi, and to see her arc really parallel that of Luke's in The Empire Strikes Back, where she's isolated on this planet with some crabby old guy and is learning her powers and is not exactly doing all the right things all the right time, and is struggling confronting her own darkness like Luke does in the cave on Dagobah, and then ultimately leaving her cranky old guy mentor just like Luke did. So I think there are some very nice parallels there, and I think that overall she has a very interesting arc. And one more thing I'll say before I shut up is that I'm a big fan of the Rey Nobody plotline. I really wish that she was nobody, and that she was not connected to any famous person, much less Palpatine. But I really like the idea that she's just some rando who's really struggling to find her place in the galaxy. And I think that this movie does a good job of showing that. So I'm looking forward to being completely contradicted by Haley.
I don't have much hate towards, the Rey situation in this movie. I think, rewatching it was, some of my favorite parts were when she was on the planet with Luke. I think for me, the original sin of this film is that there's no, time jump between The Force Awakens and The Last Jedi. Whereas, every other Star Wars film, you have at least some time for the characters to develop, for the story to, develop off screen. And so, between meeting Finn and joining the Resistance and all of these things, it's been a week. By the end of, it's very, the emotional payoff at the end is it's only been a few days. And I think, it's sort of hobbled the scale of the movie to begin with. It just made it sort of smaller in scale, where they're sort of stuck in space for the entire time. And it of course, kept the trio sort of separated the entire time, which for me, when we're talking about the characters, is my biggest complaint. Finn and Poe, I just think deserved better, and it didn't really set them up for what I would have hoped. But I will say, when I watched it again, and I came into it knowing that it would disappoint me, there was more room to enjoy like some of the good stuff about it.
I gotta say, Grace, I totally agree with you about Rey Nobody, or Rey Rando, as I like to call her. So much of the power of her story in this movie is not knowing where she comes from and not understanding why the Force has picked her for this, basically for this mission. And I think, you lose a lot of that when you find out that there is a sort of genealogical explanation for it. And so I think it creates great, tension between her and Kylo in this movie, where he is trying to basically turn her to the dark side by negging her, essentially, by saying, you're worthless because you don't come from a powerful family, but I have a place for you in my grand vision, so that should be good enough for you. And of course, retroactively, we know that was nonsense. But nonsense from the creator's perspective afterwards. Although I think Rian Johnson probably didn't think it was nonsense. I really love how, for all that she's been through and for the lack of support that she's had for her whole life, she is very principled and very sort of grounded in a lot of ways. I mean, whether it is resisting Kylo's sort of temptations and really sort of being sad for him when he makes the offer at the end after all the fighting. He's like, join me, and she's like, oh, dude, like, come on, like, you don't have to do this. But then also with Luke, this is a person who is literally a living legend to her. She didn't even know he existed, as Haley said a week ago. But now she is actually serving as a conscience for him and standing up to him in a way that would have been unthinkable to people at the end of The Force Awakens. And that's all because she's sure of herself in terms of, what's right and wrong. She has, she has incorrect expectations for what Luke could exactly do if he were to step out and join them. But, when she's disillusioned by him and she sees that he doesn't want to help, she's really sort of disappointed in him too, because she can see that he is taking his previous failure way too hard, and she's almost confused that somebody would react this way. And I don't know, I just thought that it spoke really well of her that she was able to overcome what must have been, to some degree, hero worship, to basically be a reality check on this sort of cloistered, old wizard.
I think that once again here, as we did in our Force Awakens episode, we just need to take a moment to appreciate the acting that Daisy Ridley does throughout this piece, and conveying all of those emotions that Eric just outlined. And when I was rewatching it, something that really struck me was after my absolute favorite scene in the whole movie, which is the fight in the Red Room with Kylo and Rey, and they just go at these Praetorian guards. It's so extra and so unnecessary, but I love it. Just aesthetically, fight scene wise, incredible. Chef's kiss. Sorry, got distracted on tangent thinking about how great that scene is. But after that scene, when Kylo/Ben holds out his hand to her, and she's crying and going, Ben, don't do this, because she can see who he could be, and recognizes that what he's going to do is wrong, and she's unwilling to compromise her morals for him. And even though they've made this kind of connection through the Force, she's still not willing to give up what is right. She's still very sure of what the right thing to do is. And I think that Daisy Ridley just acts that whole conflict beautifully.
Yeah, she did a great job. And I will say again, I think this is an area where at least the Ben redemption arc, what she had hoped could happen, is an area that could have been better if there had been more of a time gap, because again, just a few days ago he was involved in killing billions of people. There's no reckoning with that in this, and she's just you're a tortured soul, and I see that you have issues, and maybe turn to the good side. It's he just did this, he was involved in this terrible thing, and it was only a couple of days ago, and it didn't give him any time really to grapple with the fallout of that, or the fallout of Han Solo, which it touches on that he's struggling with that and that he's, having those issues. But I think, if there were more time for that to sort of develop, it could have, been more powerful, or at least less questionable that she is, so open to talking to him after what he did.
Yeah, well, okay, so let's talk about Kylo, right? Because in this movie, we see him, he's going to end up, obviously, killing Snoke. And I will say that on rewatching the movie, it does set up fairly well his sort of souring on the relationship with Snoke, realizing that maybe he doesn't need him as much as he used to think he did. And by the way, that in itself, helps set up and I'm about to defend the Rise of Skywalker, but,
Blah.
when Han's, not even really there, a flicker of Kylo's imagination, appears to him, and that is the turning point for Kylo to become Ben. One thing that The Last Jedi does pay off is Han Solo telling Kylo at the end of The Force Awakens, Snoke is just using you, and he's going to get rid of you when he doesn't need you anymore. Now, that it does not explicitly happen, but we do see Kylo realize that he doesn't need Snoke anymore, and that Snoke has been sort of mistreating him or tormenting him to a certain degree. So there is some setup for the idea of both, I'm going to just get rid of Snoke, and then also maybe my dad was right about just sort of my arc in general. But of course, in this movie, he doesn't get there yet. And as we've talked about, he does recommit himself to the dark side, and explicitly reject the idea of, Rey is like, okay, so we beat the big boss, so like the game's over now, we can like save the fleet. And he's like, oh no, you don't get it. Like, that was not about stopping the bad guy. That was about like, I'm gonna be the big bad now.
Yeah, exactly. I'm the one who has power now. And I do think also something that's so good about the Snoke-Kylo relationship is when Snoke is like, you're just a child in a mosque. And then Kylo destroys his mask. And it's incredible. It's like, yeah, you look like a friggin' dork. Like this play acting at Darth Vader when you're just a whiny 20-something who just has daddy issues. You should destroy that mask. And so then he does.
And fortunately, he obviously never rebuilds it and puts it back on, because that just wouldn't make any sense.
Yeah, that would
there'd
just
be no
ruin
reason
it.
to do that. Yeah,
that would just totally ruin the symbolism of destroying the mask in the first place. Yes, I know, it would really be wild if they decided to recreate it in the next movie.
One thing I will say about the Kylo situation in this movie is there's like this scene early on where, Kylo like connects through the Force with his mom. And it's when they're like attacking the ship, and he knows that she's on the bridge or something, and so he chooses not to fire. And then one of his comrades like fires, and she like floats through space, and all of that happens. But later on, like you mentioned, Eric, the shuttles are getting shot at. She's on one of them, and he sort of has clearly resolved himself not to care anymore, because he's like, oh, just let them die, So I think it's interesting that at one moment in the movie, he's, hesitates and doesn't want to kill his mother. And then later on, it's like, whatever. Yeah,
well, I mean, and as Snoke says, like, he sensed, Kylo's conflict earlier. And I think that conversation was before Kylo flew out and didn't kill his mom. But in that whole section of the movie, he was conflicted. And then later, as Snoke says, where there was conflict, I now sense, resolve or whatever. And yes, he had at that point basically said, okay, look, if I'm going to do this, like, I just can't afford to have this feeling anymore for my mom. I have to just, as he even says, let the past die. And
kill it if you have to.
Yeah,
so
he is explicitly telling Rey, like, if we're going to make the galaxy orderly and, and basically fulfill, my destiny, I cannot afford to look backwards at all. And so, yes, even in the space of this movie, he does change with respect to, how he feels about Leia.
I also feel like we have to address the relationship between Rey and Kylo in this movie.
The Force Skyping.
And I have to say, I'm not a Reylo shipper, so let's just preface that. Very important that you all know that. But I do think that it's a pretty cool conceit. I totally agree with Haley that the fact that there wasn't time in between movies kinds of initially makes their connection weird because it's only been a few days. But there is something super cool about Skyping your mortal enemy involuntarily and then becoming kind of allies and then fighting off the bad guy and then realizing that you've had different goals all along. Just narratively, that's a pretty cool way to get across both Kylo and Rey's characters and outline the fundamental differences between them and their own development. And I believe that if they had kept it platonic and just kind of had them turn into weird frenemies by the third movie, that it would have been real nice. But, no one consulted me, so here we are.
Yeah, the forced Skyping thing introduces this interesting element, or at least shows it, which is, I talked earlier about how I was really impressed that Rey is so mature when she's interacting with Luke. But, with the forced Skyping, Kylo is the one who, in all, like, the first 3 times that they connect in that way, she is very emotional, and she's like, well, I don't know what's going on, but I do know that I'm talking to this monster, and so I'm going to call him a monster, and I'm going to yell at him and all that. But he's very, like, calm. He's like, yes, I am a monster. He wants to figure out how this is happening, and she's still yelling at him for killing Han Solo, and he's like, how are you doing this? You can't be doing this. He's very clinical, and she's very hot-headed, and it's a great it's the flip side of what happens later, where he's the one who's like insistent on like, join me, very emotionally driven, like, come with me. And she's very sort of intellectually like recognizing like, no, this is ridiculous. Like, no, I'm not going to go with you. And it made for an interesting twist, I thought. And it showed how he's significantly older than her. And so in moments like this, where there's something new that's happening, there is still an element of her that is the scavenger from Jakku, who doesn't understand what's going on and is very sort of in over her head, and he is the one who's sort of like the master of a lot of these situations.
Until the end, as you said, Eric, I think one of the cool developments of this movie is seeing Kylo go from being like cool and seeming sort of as if he is in control and master of his own emotions. I mean, obviously he has tantrums like the mask destroying because he's a whiny baby. But other than that, just seeming kind of cool and like he has a plan and like he knows what he wants. And then by the end of the movie, once Rey leaves him and before he goes and fights with Luke, he's just like crazy. I mean, the iconic blow that piece of junk out of the sky.
So funny. And then, of course, I have to just say that leads to like my favorite line probably in the movie, which is where Poe's like, oh, she drew him off, all of them. And Finn goes, oh, yeah, they hate that ship.
Yeah. And seeing him so emotional when fighting Luke and realizing at the end that he's lost in a very fundamental way, even if it feels like he's gained power. I just think that's neat.
Something else that I think is pretty neat in this movie, you see what I did there with the segue, is the character growth for Poe. I think that this was actually pretty well done. And I'm know that...
fight you on this, Eric.
All right. Let me set this up. Obviously controversial, Holdo got a lot of hate for, basically saying that one of the main characters is wrong. And I think that's a big theme of this movie, is the main characters are wrong. And it's the new characters, predominantly women, who tell them how wrong they are. And so you can understand why that generated a backlash. But Poe starts off very reckless. He destroys the whole bomber fleet for a mission that arguably, you could make a case for it, but was unnecessary. And by the end of it, he is realizing when a situation is futile and, when you need to bow out, and it's not, it's not necessary to have that heroic, sacrifice for no point. He's recognizing, and you can even see Leia sort of acknowledges this, he's recognizing what it means to be a leader. And I just think that was pretty well done.
So I will say the beginning sequence where they do that, like, bombing raid is so well done. It's like the cinematography is beautiful. It's just really cool to watch. My main complaint with the Poe thing is that, like, you only get 3 movies in this trilogy, and the entire film was Poe being wrong and an idiot. And at the end of it, he's like, man, I'm an idiot. Like, I should not do stuff. But it's like, he had so many of his comrades die in that bombing raid. Like, you easily could have had the same message where he has to, early on after that, grapple with, you know, the consequences of the hot-headedness. Instead, it just continues for the rest of the movie and just sort of, like, prevents any other plot line for him. And I will say this, the argument that his plan was, you know, tremendously stupid compared to Holdo's plan is just questionable to me. When you watch it, it's like, oh, I'm sure the Empire will not notice that we have dozens of ships leaving ours to ferry everyone off to the planet that's suddenly out the window. She just counts on the fact that the Empire's not going to notice that.
But they don't. They don't notice until DJ tells them.
They have 2 very force-sensitive people on that. They were on the same, like, the ship that was there. So I don't think it was the wisest plan. Like, oh, like, clearly that plan is miles superior than Poe's. Like, that to me is questionable. But I will say, the light speed, like, crashing the ship into the other ships was the coolest part of the movie.
It is dope. I am going to kind of carve a nice little middle ground here between Eric and Haley. I know, wild. Compromise is possible. So I agree with you, Haley, that it is really annoying that Holdo doesn't just tell him the plan.
And can I just say before we move on, it was ridiculous that he stages a rebellion, does a mutiny, and they're like, haha, that was funny, and he's like knocked out, and they just move on with their lives. Like, they're like, that is not how you would handle that in any actual real situation. Like, he was treasonous. Like, that's not how it works in real life. And she's like, oh, I like him. He has spunk. Like, no, he just, like, threatened your entire plan and the safety of everyone, you know, on the ships that you're trying to rescue. And, like, that to me was just sort of like, you know, the stakes were low in the end because they just sort of gave him a slap on the wrist. They should have committed to it. They should have like kicked him out, you know?
I think that Poe's arc starts out so strong because that opening sequence, as you mentioned, Haley, I mean, it's beautifully done. It's really emotional, and you understand why Poe would make this reckless decision, even as it's killing people, killing his allies. And I think that there was room for Poe to grapple with that and to grapple with failure throughout the movie, but instead having Holdo just belittle him without trying to introduce any nuance to it, or have her even give him a hint of what's happening. Like, I understand he's just been demoted and she doesn't need to reassure this cocky pilot. That's an important plot point. But, you know, she should also be able to tell, like, he's gonna do something dumb. So she should probably address that, because she's supposedly a good leader. So, like, you'd think she would notice when 20 people or so are like, hey, let's mutiny.
Right, it wasn't just Poe. It was like she did not inspire confidence in enough people that they could take over the ship. Like, it was not good.
I mean,
I'm sorry, I just have one more thing to add on Holdo, and that is my boyfriend. He did not watch the movie with me when I rewatched it, but he was just kind of walking past and he saw Holdo and he went, oh, look, it's Kirsten Cinema.
Wow. All right.
Referring to the the senior senator from Arizona. But she often wears wigs. So for the political fans out there, awesome. I thought you'd enjoy that.
I'll just say this about Holdo. I think Grace, you sort of mentioned in passing my rationalization for her treatment of Poe, which is he's been demoted. She doesn't know him. She doesn't trust him. She outranks him. And as much as this is a ragtag group, which explains why they can't just actually leave him in the brig for mutiny as they would in a real army, as much as it is a ragtag group, you need chain of command. And if Leia trusts her to formulate, battle plans, then the people who are outranked by her also need to trust her. Otherwise, we don't have any military force. And, this has always been a kind of loosey-goosey movement, and I'm including the rebellion here when I talk about sort of just the good guys in general. But you need chain of command to some degree. And I think the knock on Holdo is not that she doesn't treat Poe like the main character of a Star Wars movie. For me, it's that she doesn't recognize that the problems that's going to cause. I fully back, her not indulging him and creating this moral hazard of continuing to, make him feel like he didn't do something wrong by continuing to share information with him. The knock on her is fine. Don't do that, but recognize that it could create some problems and put him under watch or something like that.
Yeah, exactly. I totally agree with that 100%.
So, speaking of not being willing to choose a side, as Grace was between Haley and me, so we got Finn in this movie, and we talked last time about how Finn is kind of shortchanged in this trilogy, and by kind of, I mean quite substantially. But I will say, I do think that he gets a grain of an interesting story arc here when you look at him emerging from the First Order, wanting to flee, as he says, at Maz's castle because the fight is hopeless. Acting on that at the beginning of this movie, really just to save Rey. And then by the end of the movie, he is the one charging at the cannon and, going to sacrifice himself for what he knows is a futile mission just because he knows that they're the bad guys and there's absolutely no way in good conscience he can just let them get away with it. That's a pretty significant arc for him, I would say, in this movie.
Can I just say the dissonance of Holdo, crashing her ship into the Empire ships a few minutes before there's this whole emotional scene between Rose and Finn where she's like, oh, we don't fight against the thing, try to, hurt the things we hate. We are trying to preserve the things we love. Suicide bombings aren't good now. And
I did find that
much. Yeah.
That line was strange because in war, a lot of preserving what you love is fighting what you hate.
Yeah,
so, on just a practical level, I don't necessarily know that there was dissonance in terms of the actual, the sort of the tactical elements, because the movie established that ramming the cannon wouldn't actually do anything, whereas we saw she had a pretty significant effect with the light speed trick. So, I mean, that definitely had an effect, and I think we were meant to understand that this would not have had an effect.
Yeah, and I think it's so hard to talk about Finn's arc in this movie because on the one hand, I really think overall Finn was shortchanged and that we should have seen him sort of discover his own Force sensitivity and seen that arc for him.
Yes.
I really do believe that, and it makes me sad that we didn't get to see that. On the other hand, I have to admit, I like the Canto Bite sequence. I know a lot of people don't, but I think that it's good because it helps, for Finn, it helps him solidify, why he wants to fight beyond just he believes in Rey. He believes now in a cause. As I write in my notes, it teaches you that the real enemy is the wealthy taking advantage of violence to enrich themselves. And I just think that's a neat little message to insert into a Star Wars movie to be hey, war is bad.
I loved the subtlety of it.
Yeah, I mean...
And by that I mean the non-subtlety of it.
Yes. I mean, it's Star Wars. You can't expect it to exactly be subtle.
The one thing I will say, I liked the little, horse-watching children. I thought those were cute children. And honestly, the third movie would have been better if they had just, skipped 20 years and, followed Little Broom Boy or something. I liked that part of it. The whole, side plot of, oh, you have to find a hacker and, I was not a fan of what they did to Finn in this. Especially because, at the end of the last one, he's facing one of the top people in the, in the First Order. Like, he picks up a lightsaber and is ready to fight Kylo Ren. And he does for several seconds there. And then at the beginning of this one, he's just like, oh, it's time to go now. Like, we're going to lose. So for me, it was sort of frustrating to see that step backward, and then to sort of have this, like, moral journey for Finn where it's like, oh, yes, the rich people are bad. But there was not a lot of room for him to grow personally. Like, his arc was sort of used to, like, teach the audience something. But one thing I did think was interesting was, this sort of cynicism of, what was the guy's name? The hacker that they just sort of found in the prison?
DJ.
Yeah, the cynicism that he sort of had at the end where he betrayed them and was like, it doesn't matter, like, you guys will be fighting again in a couple of weeks. Like, this is, like, it just keeps going on. And Finn sort of chooses to reject that. Like, yes, there is moral good, even if there are people who benefit from the conflict. Like, you can still choose to support, the good side, the side that is not killing, billions of people in star systems. So I thought that part was interesting. But for me, the main frustration is that, Finn doesn't get to see Rey again until the end of the movie. And he didn't get to explore, the Force sensitivity or any of that in this. And it just sort of hobbled the rest of the trilogy. Because it didn't explore any of that, in the third one either.
Yeah, the argument in favor of Finn kind of wanting to desert at the beginning of this movie was at the end of The Force Awakens. He decides to follow Rey, and he believes in Rey. And so the idea is that now at the beginning of this movie, it's not that he is necessarily deserting the rebellion so much as looking for Rey. That's the argument they're making. I don't find it totally convincing. I do think it's a little bit weird. And I would have really liked to see more development of Finn as a Jedi. But I can see how they would take those narrative threads. One more thing I will add too is that Finn's story is a great introduction to the character Rose, who I think is just an awesome character and so layered and so good, and Kelly Marie Tran did such a good job. And to conclude that, both Finn and Rose were gypped by putting them into this weird pseudo-romance at the end, which then pays off to absolutely nothing in the next movie.
Can I just say, before we move on from Finn, sort of on that note, I noticed again this time how many times they hinted at the Rey-Finn romance. Like, yes. Both Rey and Finn throughout the movie are talking about each other to everyone else.
The first thing Finn says when he wakes up is not, where am I or why am I naked, but where's Rey?
Where's Rey? And there's this scene later where Rey is leaving Luke, and she tells Chewie, like, if you see, Finn, like, tell him. And then Chewie makes a little grunting noise, so we don't know what she's gonna say, but we assume it's something sweet or, like, intimate. And and they have this hug at the end of the movie, and it's just so frustrating to me that, like, clearly it's still there. They're just, like, teasing us at this point. Because, I mean, it's...
Yes, it's clear that they... Exactly. I think Rian Johnson, as much as, he very clearly set the stage for Rayglow, I think he was really personally...
He left it alive, at least.
Yes, absolutely. On Finn, briefly, I'll just say, I think people probably expect me to like the Canto Bite sequence because ultimately they are looking for a hacker, and that is very cyber. So that is in my wheelhouse. This entire movie, basically, the whole subplot was about cyber. But I thought it was dumb. I mean, I kind of agree with everybody who was saying that this is unnecessary. It was, the production design was great, and it did give Rose an opportunity to show Finn, to give him this moral clarity, to combat what DJ was trying to basically poison his mind with. And it also gave us, Broom Boy and his friends, which that to me is one of the best parts of the movie, is where Rose points the signet ring at them and sort of opens it, and you see the resistance symbol, and their faces light up. It's this great example of how they are affecting people out there in the galaxy, that the resistance means something to regular people. But yeah, I mean, the hacker thing, I would love to see a version of this movie where two of the main characters don't have to go off and do a completely separate side quest that ultimately, isn't
fails.
Crucial. Yeah, it fails, and that's fine for me that it fails. I don't need the main characters to always succeed, but it was pointless.
I will amend my defense of the Canto Bight sequence to say that I agree the hacker plotline is dumb, and if they could have found a way to do a similar thing that they did in the Canto Bight sequence without the hacker plotline, then that would have been better, in my opinion.
And this sort of goes back to what I was saying, like, just the scope of the movie is just, like, hindered by the fact that it's only a couple days later and they're stuck in the ship, and like what else could you do with Finn and Rose in the rest? Like, I don't know. And like they had to do something, but because they were stuck on the ship running out of fuel and all this, like the whole movie, it's like the movie's like a day long, like and it just doesn't give much room for like a lot of interesting stuff for Finn. And yeah, go ahead.
I was also going to say, just very briefly, I don't think there's dissonance between Finn at the end of The Force Awakens and the beginning of this movie, because, as Grace said, he was really fighting for Rey at the end of the last movie. And as we've noted, there's basically no time passes between when he defends Rey and when he wakes up and deserts, right? Because literally he's knocked out and then he wakes up and he wants to go find her. So for him, it's not like I stuck with the good guys, but now I'm leaving them. It's like I stood up for Rey and then the whole world went black, and now I want to make sure she's safe. So personally, that worked for me, but, your mileage may vary. We've been talking around him a lot, so let's finally talk about Luke. Probably the most controversial element of this movie is, the fact that for decades, people had been wondering what it would look like to see Luke Skywalker step out and save the day, several decades after Return of the Jedi and building the new Jedi Order and all that. I mean, countless book series imagining what that would look like. And he's a grumpy hermit who doesn't want anything to do with everybody. So what were your first reactions, and has that continued to be your reaction, or have you changed how you thought about it?
I ultimately think that, first of all, no matter what you think about Luke's character in this movie, Mark Hamill acts the hell out of it.
Yes.
Like, he is so good at showing Luke's disillusionment and pain and his arc until he gets to the end of the movie and the final showdown with Kylo. I like seeing heroes fall. That sounds kind of dark. But I think it's an interesting thing to explore, particularly in a Star Wars movie, is what about when the good guy fails? And I think that it's really interesting to see that played out in Luke Skywalker, who has been, for 40 years, this paragon of good and always doing the right thing. And it's really interesting to see, what happens when he messes up, what happens when he falls. And so I understand the critiques of his character in this movie, but ultimately I think it's more interesting, if not more satisfying, to see him in cranky old man hermit mode.
Yeah, I think even the first time I watched it, I didn't hate the Luke stuff. I thought it was interesting to see, him grappling with that, and of course Mark Hamill did a great job. So it might be like a generational thing. Like if your idea of Luke is very firmly entrenched and he's the optimist and you have thought for decades about what he's doing now, you're much more likely to be upset about he's cynical and having a hard time and wants to let the Jedi Order die, but I thought it was interesting to sort of explore those themes, and I think what Rian Johnson does well is he really understands the prequel trilogy.
Yes.
And he brought that into it, which
Yes.
Luke, of course, didn't get to watch the prequels and wasn't entirely in the know about how the Jedi Order was, completely bloated and just did a terrible job. And, on there watched the Sith, rose. But, he mentioned all of those things. And, you can tell he's just very disillusioned in a way that, someone who watched the prequels would understand. So I thought that part was interesting. But I will say one of my favorite things is, the interaction with the Force Ghost Yoda, and, Yoda smacks him on the head, in the face, and, sets the tree on fire. And, I thought that scene was, really good. So I liked the Luke stuff. It's, for me, which I'm probably the biggest critic of The Last Jedi here. It's just, the Poe and the Finn stuff just really gets to me. But I did enjoy, watching Luke and, him sort of coming around after, having sort of a traumatic experience with Kylo and, having all of that guilt,
Yeah, I would love to see a survey of people about, what do you think about Luke? And then broken down by, did you or did you not spend 20 years reading expanded universe novels about him? I think that's a real phenomenon that explains some of the bitterness. Is you've had this idea built up that he's one thing, and you're having a hard time acknowledging that that's actually not the authoritative story. This is. And it's not a version that you like. You like the old stuff better. I think that's a huge part of it. I would love to hear if listeners could, self-identify as how they felt about it and where they fall on that dividing line. But I liked it. I mean, I thought it challenged us in our understanding of what this kind of person would do after this kind of failure. Would he see it in perspective, or would he overreact? And Yoda is that element of making it clear to the audience and to Luke that he's still Luke Skywalker. He's still, in some ways, always looking to the horizon, never focus on the here and now. And that is part of the problem, is that he just sort of, he overreacted. He took his failure too far, not realizing that, as Yoda said, sometimes the point of failing is to recognize where you went wrong and get back out there. And he obviously just thinks that there's no point in that. And that's kind of, learning the wrong lesson from his failure. At the end of the movie, of course, he sort of does stride out there, albeit, as a Force projection, but he learns the right lesson in the end. And by the way, I just want to say, as a big R2-D2 stan, everybody knows this about me. It's not just Yoda who teaches him, and Rey who teaches him that he's got to do the right thing. Arguably, the pivotal moment is when R2 plays the clip of Leia, help me, Obi-Wan Kenobi, you're my only hope, and sort of gets him to realize, you've been here before. And look, what if Obi-Wan, who had failed miserably in the prequels, didn't heed the call from Leia to go help? And that's sort of the moment where he sort of says, that was a cheap move. But listen, it works, and it does remind him that you are still needed. Even if, he's initially reluctant to actually get back out there, he does start trying to help Rey to some degree. And I just love I love that scene with R2 so much.
That is a really good scene. And I mean, I think so many of the Luke scenes are so good. Obviously, the climactic end duel with Kylo is just excellent. It's Luke Skywalker, big hero, going out there, walking, facing down the whole First Order with his laser sword, as he derisively says earlier in the movie.
But it's a subversion of what you expect, which is why it's so great.
That's exactly it, is that you think, oh, I know how this is going to go, but you don't. It's not what you expect at all. And I also will say, Haley, when Luke references the prequels in theaters, I remember being so excited. I was like, he just talked about the Old Republic. Those are my bros.
Oh, by the way, so I forgot to mention this, but another thing I like about Luke in this movie is he's still funny. Even though he has sort of given up on a macro level, he's very disillusioned. On a micro level, he's still, funny. I mean, there's that great moment where he's milking the Thala-Siren, the animal, and he looks at Rey and he gives her the eating grin where it's like, yeah, good stuff here. And And then he's talking to her about where she's from, and she's like, I'm from nowhere. And he's like, no one's from nowhere. Jakku. Okay, that's pretty much nowhere. Like, he's still Luke, and I think that, it's hard to do that as a writer and as a director to balance. Like, you want people to understand that this person is fundamentally broken on an important level, but you also want them to see that person, that core of who they liked about that person, is still in there.
Yeah, very much so. And I think that is a credit, again, to Mark Hamill and to Rian Johnson as the architect of this particular plot line in working to achieve that balance.
Can I just say, while we're talking about this movie, Crait, that's the planet at the end, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It looks like such a tasty little cookie.
It
like
does.
There's these red velvet cookies that have powdered sugar on them, and like the whole planet looks like that. And it's just, first of all, beautiful, but also makes me want to eat those kinds of cookies.
Do you want to eat Crait? Is that what you're saying?
I do. It looks tasty to me.
It's literally salt, though. There's literally a moment where the guy walks out.
Big
By the
fan
way,
of that guy.
that guy, fantastic, walks out.
Love that guy.
Tastes it and is like, salt. Thanks, bro.
Salt.
Like, the point of that moment was, I think, just for us to know that it wasn't just another.
It's perfect writing.
Yeah.
It wasn't just another snow planet. Like, I think that was the point of that.
Salt.
By the way, the guy next to him is Gareth Edwards, director of Rogue One.
Oh, fun.
Yeah, little
but
tidbit.
I love that moment because you're right, it's just for audience appreciation, but what kind of absolute maniac goes to a planet they've never been to before?
It's like, I'm gonna lick this. I'm gonna lick
tastes
this.
the dirt. And then spits it out.
By the way,
Salt.
you just know that guy, like, everywhere the Resistance goes, that's the guy where they're like, Dave, don't taste the planet. Like,
He's like,
he's
clay.
like, I'm gonna taste the planet. Yeah,
Dirt.
lava.
Sand. Yeah.
All right, well, let's wrap it up with the character who, retrospectively, or I guess retroactively, looms large in this movie because of what happened in the real world, and that is Leia. We know that Carrie Fisher's untimely death really scrambled plans for the rise of Skywalker. In this movie, though, this was all how it was going to happen anyway. Because she did finish her filming with no issues there. But what did people think about her arc in this movie, especially, trying to sort of get Poe ready for leadership, a sort of a tacit admission that, her time is nearing an end?
Well, I think it starts so strong with Leia. I mean, how she just comes out of the gate with the quips and also being shown as a strong leader. And then the hint that we get that she's force sensitive, I mean, that just really warms my heart so much. But then she's sidelined. Then she goes into a coma for like an hour and a half. And again, I understand, they thought they would have another movie with Leia. And Mark Hamill has said that the intention for Rise of Skywalker was kind of to be Carrie's movie in the way that Force Awakens was for Harrison Ford and Last Jedi was for him. So I understand, obviously, they couldn't plan for that, but it still makes me very sad, especially knowing that she would die and that her final movie where she's acting really in the Star Wars movie, she gets comatose for an hour and a half.
Yeah. I will say, like, a lot of people have said they don't like the scene where she sort of Mary Poppins her way back into the ship. I don't hate it. I think it's sort of fun to have some whimsy. And, this movie, I will say, like, I've seen a couple people, tweet or something where it's like, my kids have watched The Force Awakens, like, 20 times. And they've watched Last Jedi and Rise of Skywalker once each. And, like, that is, like, Last Jedi is more mature and it is not as fun. Like, that,
yeah.
It's just not as fun of a movie, but it's a challenging movie. And there are fun moments. And I think, the Mary Poppins thing was like, oh, here's, like, a fun moment. Like, there's room for things that aren't realistic. One other thing I liked was, her and Luke sort of reuniting at the end.
Yes.
I remember being frustrated that he wasn't there in real life and that he just sort of faded into nothingness afterward, because I wanted them to spend more time together. And it was just sad to me that, that was it for them. But it was good to, be able to see that moment before he faced Kylo Ren.
Something that I caught this time around, which I don't think I had appreciated before, is that when Luke and Leia reunite, they hold hands for a moment, and that's significant. It's so sweet, but it's significant too because he's not really there.
Yeah,
he's a force projection, but it shows the depth of their relationship, that they're still able to physically connect like that, and also shows how Leia is force sensitive as well, because she has the ability to be with him on the same plane that he's on.
And she sort of I think she recognizes what's happening. There is that moment where she looks at him, and I think she kind of knows in that moment that he's not really there.
Right.
And yeah, I also I'll just second what you both said, that it's really a shame that she didn't get to have that third movie to herself, because this movie certainly set up a lot of interesting things about her, not only as a leader of this movement, but also as a Force user, and the road not taken there, and the relationship with Luke, again, complicated by what happened to her son and his role in that, which just didn't get enough time for obvious reasons. But it was really fantastic. So yeah, look, we've talked about how we could go on for hours about this movie. We will obviously have other opportunities to talk about it. There's a lot we didn't get to beyond these particular characters. The last thing I will say is R.I.P. Akbar. Gone too soon. All right, well, that's going to do it for this episode. Thank you so much for listening. If you want to share your thoughts about this episode or suggest topics for future shows, you can email us at hothtakes@gmail.com or find us on Twitter. We're at hothtakes. I'm at Eric Geller on Twitter. Grace is at Grace_Seegers, and Haley is at Birdinator. Haley made our fantastic logo and our banner art, which continue to amuse me every time I look at them. I edited the show. I also put together our music, although I'm being told by our lawyers here at Hoth Takes Incorporated that we do need to point out that all the Star Wars themes and sound effects are the intellectual property of Lucasfilm. If you want to listen to past episodes, we do have a few of them now. You can find those on our website, hothtakes.wordpress.com. And if you enjoy the show, or even if you don't enjoy the show, send it to a friend or family member or enemy. You can tell them to subscribe on iTunes, Google Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, pretty much wherever you get your podcasts. We'll see you next time. May the Force be with you.